Chen hunched over the terminal, the blue glow painting their face in the dim light of the weather station. Outside, the wind howled, a familiar, desolate symphony against the reinforced glass. Rain lashed in sheets, obscuring the already remote landscape. It was a monotonous existence, punctuated only by the rhythmic ping of data uploads and the occasional crackle of the long-range radio. Days bled into weeks here, tracking isobaric systems and microclimates in a corner of the world few ever saw, let alone visited. The isolation was a comfort, a predictable void that mirrored the quiet hum of the station's machinery. The air smelled of ozone and stale coffee. A half-eaten sandwich lay beside a stack of printouts, forgotten. The shrill ring of the landline, archaic in its insistency, cut through the drone. Chen flinched, hand hovering over the keyboard. The station phone rarely rang. Emergencies were handled by satellite comms. This was different. A landline meant an outside line, a connection to the world Chen had deliberately put distance between. With a sigh, Chen picked it up. Weather Station Alpha 7, Chen speaking. Is this Chen, offspring of the late Alara Chen? A crisp, disembodied voice, utterly devoid of the usual rural inflection, came through the receiver. Chen frowned. Yes, who is this? Alara was a great aunt, a name from a dusty corner of the family tree, barely a memory. My name is Arthur Pendelton, from Pendelton and Associates. I'm calling regarding the estate of Alara Chen. It has come to our attention that you are the sole remaining heir. Chen's brow furrowed. Heir? I didn't even know she had an estate. We weren't close. Indeed. It appears your great-aunt was rather reclusive. Her will specifies that her ancestral home, located in the Blackwood Fells, is to be bequeathed to you. It's a rather substantial property, though I must warn you it has fallen into considerable disrepair. Isolated, too. Quite off the beaten path. Pendleton's voice was dry, factual, giving no hint of personal opinion, which somehow made the news even more unsettling. We've attempted to contact other relatives, but the line appears to end with you, Mr. Ms. Chen. Chen corrected. It's Chen. The thought of a house, an ancestral one at that, was utterly alien. Chen had no roots, no fixed address beyond the station's bunk. The Blackwood Fells? I've heard of that area. Very remote. Precisely. The property includes several acres of undeveloped land, bordering the old forest. The house itself dates back to the late 17th century, though there have been additions over the years. We require your presence to formally accept the inheritance and discuss its disposition. A dilapidated house in the middle of nowhere. It sounded like a burden, a drain on time and resources Chen didn't have. Chen's life was ordered, predictable, grounded in scientific observation. This was chaos, an unexpected intrusion from a past Chen had never sought to understand. The idea of traveling, of leaving the familiar confines of the station, felt like shedding a skin. There was a strong impulse to simply decline, to tell Pendleton to donate it, sell it, whatever. But then, a different thought began to needle at the edges of Chen's mind. Ancestral home. The phrase itself was a historical artifact. Chen's academic background, before the call of the isolated weather station, had been in historical geography, with a particular interest in forgotten settlements and the impact of landscape on human habitation. A house dating back to the 17th century, nestled in an ancient, remote forest? It wasn't just a house. It was a potential trove of primary source material. A forgotten branch of the Chen family, living in isolation for centuries. What stories could that house tell? What secrets might its walls hold about the people who built it, lived in it, and ultimately left it to crumble? The reluctance, a thick blanket of comfort, began to fray at the edges. This wasn't just an inconvenience. It was an opportunity. A chance to apply academic curiosity to their own forgotten lineage. It was a historical puzzle, a genealogical mystery waiting to be solved. The idea of dusty ledgers, forgotten letters, even just the architectural evolution of such a place, ignited a spark Chen hadn't felt in years. A different kind of curiosity than the scientific one that governed their days. "When would you need me there?" Chen asked, the words surprising even themselves. "As soon as possible, within the next 2 weeks, if you please. We can arrange for transport from the nearest major town, Oakhaven." "I'll be there," Chen said, the decision solidifying with the spoken words. "I'll make arrangements here at the station." Hanging up, Chen stared at the blinking cursor on the screen, the weather data suddenly seeming trivial. Chen pulled up a topographic map of the Blackwood Fells, zooming in on the specified coordinates. A small, almost imperceptible dot marked the location of the property, deep within a tangle of green, far from any established road. It was a blank space on the map, a place where the modern world hadn't bothered to intrude. A place ripe for discovery, or something else entirely. Chen began to type out a request for leave, the details of the weather patterns fading as the image of a forgotten, isolated house, shrouded in ancient trees, began to take shape in their mind's eye. A house full of history. A house full of secrets. The last paved road had given way to a ribbon of gravel an hour ago. And now even that was gone, replaced by a pair of rutted tracks swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. Chen's old sedan groaned in protest, its suspension bottoming out more often than not. The trees, once distant sentinels, pressed in close, their branches forming a skeletal tunnel that blocked out the sky, plunging the afternoon into a premature twilight. The air grew heavy, damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and something else. Something ancient, like undisturbed soil and forgotten wood. Then, through a sudden break in the canopy, it appeared. Not a house, but an edifice. It squatted on a rise, a sprawling asymmetrical silhouette against the bruised sky. Gabled roofs fought for prominence with an incongruous squat tower. Chimneys, too numerous and too slender, pierced the heavens like broken fingers. Were choked by ivy that clung like a suffocating shroud. It wasn't merely old, it was weary, its very structure sighing under the weight of centuries. He stepped out, the gravel crunching loudly under his boots. It carried a faint metallic tang beneath the pervasive scent of decay. A path, barely discernible, led to a massive splintered oak door, its iron hinges rusted solid. With a key provided by the estate's distant solicitors, a heavy, ornate thing that felt like a relic itself. Chen forced the door open. It protested with a drawn-out shriek that echoed through the cavernous entrance hall, sending a shiver down his spine. Inside, the gloom was absolute, broken only by slivers of weak light filtering through grimy, leaded glass windows high above. The air was thick with the smell of dust, mildew, and something else. Something cloying and sweet, like dried flowers and forgotten dreams. A grand staircase, its banister intricately carved but warped by time, curved upwards into the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beam, tiny, ephemeral galaxies. It wasn't empty. It was full of an absence, a presence of what was no longer there. Chen began his initial exploration. The house was a labyrinth. Corridors twisted unexpectedly, sometimes narrowing suddenly, sometimes widening into alcoves that served no apparent purpose. He found doors that opened onto solid walls, or worse, onto smaller, shallower alcoves barely deep enough for a single person to stand. One long hallway seemed to subtly slope downward, an optical illusion perhaps, but it left him feeling perpetually off balance, as if trying to reach some unseen higher floor. The architecture was a jarring patchwork. Stone lintels above doorways were carved with symbols that seemed almost familiar, then dissolved into meaningless geometric patterns upon closer inspection. It was as if different builders, from different eras, with different intentions, had each added their piece to a sprawling, incoherent puzzle, with no one ever quite finishing. The overwhelming sense of age permeated everything. Wallpaper, peeling in delicate curls, revealed layer upon layer of faded patterns beneath. Furniture, draped in white sheets like silent waiting ghosts, sagged under the weight of decades. It was in a small, windowless study, tucked away behind a false bookcase, that Chen made his first unsettling discovery. The room itself was unremarkable, filled with the scent of decaying paper and dry rot. Following an instinct, Chen pressed against it. A small, almost invisible seam appeared, and with a soft click, a narrow panel swung inward. Behind it was not a cavity for wiring or a forgotten safe. Instead, tucked into the shallow space were dozens of tightly rolled parchments, brittle with age. He carefully extracted one, his fingers brushing against the coarse, dry material. Unfurling it slowly, he found it covered in what looked like script. But it was unlike any language he had ever seen. The symbols were intricate, almost organic, twisting and flowing into one another in a way that defied conventional letter forms. They seemed to writhe on the page, like tiny, desiccated insects. Some appeared to be eyes, unblinking and watchful. Others resembled tendrils, reaching out from the page. He tried to decipher a single character, then another, but they yielded no meaning. The longer he stared, the more his eyes strained, the more the patterns seemed to shift, to coalesce into something menacing, just at the edge of his perception. These weren't just old texts. They were cryptic, alien, hidden deliberately, and they hummed with an unsettling silent power. The house, Chen realized, held secrets far older and stranger than mere decay, and he had only just begun to scratch the surface. The more his eyes strained, the more the patterns on the page seemed to writhe, threatening to dissolve into an illegible chaos. He blinked, rubbing at his temples, the faint scent of old paper and something else, something dry and almost metallic, tickling his nostrils. It was futile. Attempting to decipher them piece by piece was like trying to catch smoke. He needed a different approach. Pushing the single sheet aside, Chen leaned back, the old wooden chair groaning in protest. He surveyed the boxes, a towering monument to an unknown history. The sheer volume of material was daunting, but perhaps organizing it would reveal patterns, a key to its structure. It was a task that promised to consume days, if not weeks, of his isolated existence. He began with the first box, carefully lifting out stacks of brittle parchment, scrolls of tightly wound vellum, and bound volumes with covers like petrified leather. The air grew thick with the dust of ages, clinging to his clothes and making his throat feel raspy. As he meticulously arranged a pile of small, rectangular tablets, a soft, almost imperceptible sound brushed against his hearing. It was like a sigh, or the rustle of leaves in a windless room. He paused, head cocked. "Hello?" he called out, his voice sounding thin and foreign in the vast, silent room. No reply. He shook his head, dismissing it as the creak of the old building settling, or perhaps the wind playing tricks with his ears. Too much quiet. Too much solitude. That was all it was. Hours bled into one another. His hands became smudged with ink and grime. His back ached, but the piles of categorized texts slowly grew. He was halfway through the third box when it happened again, clearer this time. A low, indistinct murmur, like distant voices speaking just beyond the threshold of hearing. It was a rush of sound, a fleeting auditory hallucination that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. Chen froze, his hand hovering over a scroll. He strained his ears, but the sound had vanished, leaving only the relentless rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. He spun around, scanning the room. He exhaled slowly, a puff of dust escaping his lips. "Right," he muttered to himself, forcing a wry smile. "Sleep deprivation and too much dusty reading. That's the ticket." He pinched the bridge of his nose, the dull throb behind his eyes intensifying. He returned to his work, trying to focus on the tactile sensation of the ancient materials. He was sorting a bundle of scrolls, their tightly wound forms revealing faint, complex symbols etched into their surfaces, when a flicker caught his eye. He snapped his head up, his gaze sweeping the empty space where it had been. Just the familiar stained plaster. Chen rubbed his eyes, pressing hard. "Come on, Chen," he chastised himself aloud. "Get a grip. It's just your imagination running wild." The isolation was getting to him, he decided. The sheer emptiness of the weather station, miles from any other human contact, was starting to fray the edges of his perception. He needed to eat, to walk away from the texts for a while, clear his head. He stood up, stretching his stiff limbs, and headed toward the small kitchen. As he walked, the distance to the doorway seemed to stretch, the familiar path suddenly feeling longer. The floorboards beneath his feet subtly warped, as if he were traversing a gentle incline. He paused, frowning, looking back at the work table. Had it always been that far from the kitchen? He was certain it hadn't. A prickle of unease snaked up his spine. He shook his head again, trying to dislodge the strange sensation. This was ridiculous. The station was old. Its floors might have settled over the years. That was all. In the kitchen, he poured himself a glass of water. He glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:17 p.m. But hadn't it been 2:45 just a few minutes ago? He distinctly remembered checking it before he started sorting the scrolls. The discrepancy was minor, barely noticeable, but it tugged at the edges of his rationality. He tried to recall the exact sequence of events, but the memory felt hazy, as if the last half hour had been compressed or stretched. His mind was playing tricks, manufacturing these little distortions to cope with the unusual strain. He had to believe that. Anything else was unthinkable. He pushed away from the counter, resolutely turning his back on the kitchen. He had a job to do. The texts wouldn't organize themselves. But as he returned to the main room, the faint, dry metallic scent he'd noticed earlier seemed to grow subtly stronger, clinging to the air around the ancient volumes like an unseen shroud. He leaned against the counter, closing his eyes. His academic curiosity, once a beacon, had become a relentless tormentor. He wasn't just studying an ancient text. He felt as though he was being studied by it. The isolation, the creeping sense of being watched, the very air in the station growing heavy with unspoken things. It was all too much. He needed context. He needed to know who had created this knowledge, and more importantly, why. The nearest town, with its small municipal archives, was a 2-hour drive. The journey was a blur of highway and desolate scrubland, the landscape mirroring his internal emptiness. The archive building was a squat red brick structure, its windows like vacant eyes. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and dust, a quiet hum of forgotten lives. A stern-faced woman, the archivist, pointed him towards the local history section after he explained his research into his family's local roots. Chen began his search methodically, starting with his own name. The Chen family, he learned, had been prominent in the region for centuries, landowners and scholars. But as he delved deeper, sifting through brittle newspaper clippings and faded census records, a subtle shift emerged. The early Chens were lauded, respected. Then, further back, or in certain branches of the lineage, the descriptions changed. Eccentric, reclusive, a profound but solitary intellect. The records became sparser, punctuated by abrupt gaps. He found a mention of a donation made decades ago. A collection of family journals, deemed of limited general interest due to their arcane content. His heart hammered. He requested the box. It arrived, smelling of mold and ancient leather, tied with a fraying twine. Inside, 3 bound volumes, their covers worn smooth by time, lay nestled amongst loose correspondence. The first journal belonged to Alistair Chen, an ancestor from the late 18th century. His elegant script began with meticulous observations of the natural world. a keen scientific mind at work. But gradually, the entries shifted, laced with phrases that echoed the very esoteric knowledge Chen was now struggling to decipher. I must follow. Local records simply stated Alistair Chen had disappeared during a severe storm, presumed lost at sea. The second journal, from the mid-19th century, belonged to Eleanor Chen, a woman described in town records as a gifted artist and scholar. Her entries were less scientific, more poetic, yet the underlying obsession was identical. She wrote of attempting to render the unseen, to capture the shapes that lurk at the edge of perception. Her sketches, interspersed among the text, were unsettling, geometric forms that twisted and warped, hinting at the same symbols Chen was studying, but integrated into monstrous organic shapes. Her final entry was a single stark sentence. The veil thins. I can almost touch it. She was found dead in her study, no apparent cause, her eyes wide open, fixed on an unseen horror. Chen's hands trembled as he opened the third journal, dated to the early 20th century. It was Thomas Chen, an architect, whose entries were filled with complex diagrams. Here, the symbols were unmistakable, integrated into structural plans for buildings that could never exist, structures designed to capture or channel something immense and terrible. Thomas's writing became increasingly paranoid, filled with references to the Watchers, the shifting foundations of reality, and the constant nagging feeling of being observed. His final entry was scrawled, almost illegible. They are here. They know I see the truth. The walls, they breathe. Thomas Chen vanished from his locked study, leaving only a single indecipherable note on his desk, a string of the very symbols Chen was now deciphering. He wasn't just an academic. He was an inheritor. This wasn't just ancient knowledge. It was a family legacy, a curse. The very language, the themes, the specific symbols, they were all the same. He was not merely studying, he was following. He was the latest link in a chain of highly intelligent, reclusive Chens who had all become obsessed with the same esoteric knowledge, only to meet mysterious ends or vanish without a trace. The archive walls seemed to press in, the dust motes dancing in the dim light like unseen presences. He felt the weight of generations of obsession, of madness, settling upon his shoulders. He was not just deciphering a text, he was deciphering his own fate. He was no longer a detached observer. He was part of the pattern. He was next. The wind, a relentless sculptor, carved at the old weather station, whistling through loose panes and groaning against the corrugated iron roof. Chen sat at a scarred wooden table in the small, cramped office, the only light a bare bulb dangling from a fraying wire. Outside, the vast empty plain stretched to a horizon lost in a perpetual steel-gray sky. Instead, the quiet brought a different kind of pressure, a gnawing emptiness that mirrored the landscape. He stared at a page covered in his own handwriting, notes for his thesis, theories about forgotten knowledge, the very subject that had led him to the archive. But the words swam. He'd written them, he knew, but they felt alien, unconnected. What was this about symbiotic resonance and temporal bleed? He vaguely remembered it being crucial, a cornerstone of his argument, yet now it was just noise on the page. He picked up his pen, intending to elaborate on a concept, but his mind went blank. He tapped the pen, a nervous habit. What was the name of the scholar who first posited this theory? It was right there, on the tip of his tongue, a familiar name he'd cited countless times. He could almost see the book cover. Almost. But the name refused to materialize, a phantom limb of memory. He frowned, a knot tightening in his stomach. It wasn't the first time. Lately, small things had been slipping. Why he'd walked into a room, what he'd had for breakfast, the order of events from the previous day. He'd dismissed it as stress, the intensity of his research. But this felt different. He tried to refocus, pushing the unsettling thought away. He had to finish this section. He read a sentence aloud. The accretion of forgotten narratives creates a psychic topography. He stopped. Psychic topography. He'd written it, but it sounded like something from a bad pulp novel, not serious academic work. Had he always written like this? He felt a prickle of unease. His academic rigor, his precision, had always been his pride. Now his own words seemed to mock him, nonsensical fragments of a mind he no longer fully recognized. He moved to the small, grimy window, looking out at the endless expanse. The same unseen presences from the archive, he realized with a jolt, had followed him here. They were not just in the dust. They were in his head. A sudden, sharp ache bloomed behind his eyes. He squeezed them shut, trying to recall his schedule for the next day. A meeting with... who? He couldn't remember. Was there even a meeting? Or was that a remnant of an old routine? A ghost of a life that no longer existed? This wasn't just forgetting a name. This was his very understanding of his life, his purpose, beginning to unravel. He stumbled back to the table, desperate to ground himself. He picked up a photograph, an old, faded print of him and his parents on a beach years ago. He stared at it, searching for familiarity. He knew these faces, knew they were his family. But the warmth, the specific memories, the feeling of that day, they were gone, replaced by a dull, academic recognition. Like looking at a historical artifact, not a cherished personal memory. His academic notes, once meticulously organized, were now a chaotic mess. Pages of coherent argument were interspersed with frantic scribbles, diagrams that looked like alien glyphs, and sometimes just a single repeated word, scrawled over and over until it lost all meaning. Had he written that? He couldn't recall. The thought was terrifying. He was losing control, not just of his memories, but of the very mechanisms of thought itself. A gust of wind rattled the window violently, making him jump. He spun around, convinced he'd heard something inside the room, a low, guttural sigh. Only the incessant moan of the wind and the rhythmic drip, drip, drip from a leaky pipe in the corner. His heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't alone. He hadn't been alone since he first set foot in that archive. The entity, whatever it was feeding on him, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness, eroding his very self. It wasn't just the past it was taking. It was his ability to perceive the present, to plan for the future. He was under attack. His mind, his most precious possession, was being systematically dismantled, piece by agonizing piece. Terrifyingly alone in this internal war. He clutched his head, his fingers tangling in his hair. His mind felt like a vast, empty room, echoing with the sound of his own desperate thoughts. This was no time for weakness. The answers lay before him, painstakingly transcribed onto the station's printer paper, a mosaic of symbols and archaic script that had consumed his waking hours. He focused on the texts, an intricate tapestry of glyphs he'd discovered etched into the crumbling foundation of the old radio tower, symbols unlike any known human language, yet imbued with a terrifying, undeniable logic he was slowly unraveling. Weeks of obsessive work had chipped away at their formidable resistance. He'd found himself speaking aloud, testing pronunciations that felt alien on his tongue, the sounds echoing in the desolate station. The initial passages had spoken of a presence, an ancient observer, but the newer ones hinted at something far more insidious. His eyes scanned a particularly dense section, a series of interconnected symbols he'd been struggling with for days. It depicted a spiral, not of creation, but of dissolution, surrounding a central, unidentifiable core. A conceptual wall he couldn't breach. He traced a finger over the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. A sudden draft snaked around his ankles, though all windows were sealed. He shivered, a prickle of unease crawling up his spine. He felt watched, not just by the entity described in the texts, but by the very text itself, as if it pulsed with a malevolent sentience. Then, a pattern clicked. A recurring symbol, previously interpreted as spirit or essence, appeared in conjunction with another he'd translated as vessel or shell. But it wasn't a simple pairing. The essence symbol was shown in diminishing size, being drawn into the devourer core, while the vessel symbol remained, unchanging but empty. He stared, his breath catching in his throat. He reread the surrounding glyphs, his mind racing, pulling together fragmented insights from earlier sections. The entity wasn't a ghost, not a spectral remnant of the dead seeking revenge or solace. It was something far older, far more fundamental and terrifying. The text didn't speak of spirits, but of intellect. They spoke of memories, the spiral of dissolution, the diminishing essence, the remaining shell. It was a knowledge feeder. A primordial predator, it consumed the very fabric of identity. It didn't just end a life, it erased it. It feasted on the intricate tapestry of thoughts, experiences, and accumulated wisdom that made a being who they were. It absorbed the intellect, the memories, the personality, leaving behind a living, breathing husk, an empty vessel. Chen's hands trembled, the transcribed pages rustling faintly. He thought of the other station staff, the blank stares, the repetitive, nonsensical actions, the utter lack of recognition in their eyes. He dismissed it as madness, a strange form of catatonia brought on by isolation or some unknown toxin. But it wasn't madness. It was emptiness. They weren't insane. They were simply gone. Their bodies still moved, their hearts still beat, but the minds that once animated them, the unique spark of their being, had been meticulously, utterly consumed. The entity didn't want his life. It wanted his mind. He looked around the desolate weather station, the flickering bulb, the howling wind. He was alone, isolated, his mind a rich, complex repository of knowledge and experience. And he had been diligently, obsessively, unraveling the very instructions for its feeding. He had been shining a beacon, drawing its attention, perhaps even providing it with a menu. Not his own thoughts, but something else, something ancient and infinitely hungry. He felt a profound sense of violation, a sickening intuition that the entity was already here, already tasting the edges of his consciousness, drawn by the act of translation itself. He wasn't just reading about it. He was interacting with it, offering himself up. The world tilted. The wind outside had ceased. Only the faint phosphorescent glow of the transcribed symbols on the paper remained, an eerie, pulsing light that seemed to draw him in, beckoning him closer. The floor, once solid, now felt like a ship's deck in a gale, pitching beneath his feet. He braced himself against the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic drum against the sudden, unnatural stillness of the weather station. The hum of the servers, the gentle whir of the anemometer on the roof, even the distant, familiar whine of the wind outside. All gone. He lunged for the door, the one that led to the short corridor connecting his office to the main data analysis room. It stretched into an impossible distance, the air thick with dust and the faint metallic tang of old wiring. No windows, no light source beyond the faint spill from his office behind him. This wasn't right. He turned back, intending to retreat to the known, but the door he'd just exited was gone. In its place was a blank, grimy wall. Panic flared, hot and sharp, in his chest. He tried calling out, "Hello?" The hallway twisted, then branched into 3 identical passages. Chen chose one at random, his mind racing. He was a man of logic, of patterns and predictable systems. This was none of that. This was an aberration. He pushed forward, driven by a primal need to escape. He found himself in a room that was almost his own office, but subtly wrong. The desk was there, but it was scorched, the papers on it brittle and yellowed, crumbled at the edges. The computer monitor glowed with a static-filled image of a storm front, impossibly vast and violent, covering an entire continent. He recognized the data, not as real, but as a twisted projection of a theoretical worst-case scenario he'd once modeled. A nightmare storm that could never truly exist. Yet, here it was, vibrant and terrifying on the screen. He backed away, trying another door. This one led to the instrument calibration room, but the precision tools were rusted, covered in a fine layer of green corrosion, and the large barometer on the wall showed a pressure reading that was physically impossible. A vacuum. Beneath it, scratched into the dusty glass, were numbers. 71392. A sequence. A code? What do you want? Chen yelled, his voice cracking. He stumbled out, finding himself in a corridor lined with what looked like old weather maps. But they were not of Earth. They depicted swirling atmospheric anomalies on a barren, alien landscape, with symbols he didn't recognize. His meteorologist mind screamed in protest. This was an assault on his very understanding of reality. He kept moving, driven by a desperate hope that if he just found the right door, the right path, he could break free. He saw glimpses of his past, flickering at the edges of his vision. A failed forecast that led to public outcry. A lonely evening spent hunched over charts. The silent judgment of his colleagues. The entity was using his own knowledge, his own insecurities, weaving them into the very fabric of this impossible place. He came to a door, heavy and steel-reinforced, like a vault. On its surface, a series of complex equations were etched, involving atmospheric pressure gradients, Coriolis effect, and obscure thermodynamic constants. Chen stared, his mind racing. It was a puzzle, one designed for him. A lock that could only be opened by a specific meteorological calculation, a key forged from his own expertise. He scribbled on the dusty wall with a broken piece of plaster, his fingers numb. The numbers started to align, a solution forming. He felt a strange compulsion, a perverse satisfaction in solving the problem, even as he knew it was a trap. He finally arrived at a single 4-digit number. He pressed his palm against the steel door, and to his horror, the numbers appeared on the surface, glowing faintly, beckoning him to input the solution. He hesitated, his breath catching. What lay beyond? Was this an escape, or merely a deeper descent into the labyrinth? He was trapped, not just by walls and shifting corridors, but by his own mind, his own knowledge, twisted and weaponized against him by an unseen, malevolent force, pulsed on the steel door where Chen's palm had rested. It wasn't a code. It was a countdown, a timer. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence, a pressure against his skull that felt less like an external force and more like something unfurling within his own mind. A voice, not heard with his ears, but felt in the marrow of his bones, slithered into his thoughts. The numbers on the door weren't a demand, but a measure of its patience. Then, the choice presented itself, laid bare with the brutal clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. He saw, not with his eyes, but with the deepest parts of his intellect, a vision. On one side, a swirling vortex of vibrant, intricate thought. His own mind, his memories, his skills, his very identity, being drawn into a gaping maw. On the other, a flicker of reprieve, a temporary abatement of the consuming force, bought with a horrific toll. The entity could be sated temporarily by a significant offering of knowledge. Not just any knowledge, but the very scaffolding of his being. He could feel it, an insidious current seeking out the most complex, the most vital, the most him parts of his mind. Language, logic, memory, the sum total of his experiences, his understanding of the world, his very capacity to reason. Sacrifice a vast portion of his intellect, or risk complete mental annihilation. The alternative was a horror beyond measure. He glimpsed it. A rapid, irreversible unraveling. His thoughts would become dust, his memories shattered fragments, his consciousness a vacant, echoing chamber. He would remain a breathing shell, but Chen would be gone. A husk. The wind howled outside, a counterpoint to the silent scream building in his chest. How could he choose? How could he willingly tear away pieces of himself, knowing they would be gone forever? He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the impossible choice away, but it was already rooted deep. It was searching, probing, tasting. It knew his fear. It thrived on it. No, he rasped, his voice raw. Choose, or be chosen. He felt a part of his mind, a deep well of knowledge, begin to fray at the edges, like an old tapestry unraveling. A memory of his mother's face, sharp and clear moments ago. Blurred, its details dissolving into a formless warmth. Panic surged. This was a taste of the annihilation. The sacrifice, then. It was the only way to buy time. But how? How did one consciously surrender their own mind? A new understanding bloomed, horrifying and absolute. He had to open himself. He had to identify the parts of his intellect that constituted a vast portion and willingly offer them up. It was an act of intellectual self-immolation. He pressed his hands against his temples, as if to physically contain the torment. He thought of his life, his work, the intricate calculations, the patterns of weather, the years of learning. All of it, a vast landscape within his skull. Which part could he give? Could he give up his ability to speak, to read, to remember his own name? The thought was a fresh agony. The entity's hunger was a physical ache now, a drilling sensation behind his eyes. It wasn't asking for a specific memory, but for the capacity to have such memories, the structure of his intellect. It wanted the framework, the very essence of his cognitive being. With a shuddering breath, Chen made his choice. It was not a choice for life, but for a delayed death, a dismembered existence. He closed his eyes, forcing his mind open, a terrifying, vulnerable act. He focused on the vast, interconnected web of his knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of a lifetime. He imagined it as a great, luminous sphere within him. And then, with a guttural cry that tore from his throat, he willed a substantial portion of it to detach, to tear away. The sensation was immediate and agonizing. It was not pain, not precisely, but a horrific unmaking. A ripping, a tearing, as if threads of light were being violently pulled from a loom. He felt the structure of language crumble, the elegant curves of mathematical equations dissolve, the faces of loved ones become featureless blurs. He screamed, a sound that died in his throat, lost to the vacuum forming in his mind. He felt his identity fraying, a sense of who he was leaching away like sand through his fingers. A chunk of his understanding of the world, of his own history, was gone. He knew it was gone, but he no longer knew what it was that was gone. The very memory of the loss was fading as it happened. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, clutching his head. The numbers on the door flickered, then dimmed slightly. The entity had taken its offering. He tried to stand, but his limbs felt alien, uncoordinated. He looked around the weather station, the instruments, the familiar dials and screens. They were just shapes. He knew what they were, vaguely. But the intricate understanding of their function, their purpose, the complex data they conveyed, it was gone. Replaced by an aching, terrifying emptiness. A name. He tried to recall a name. His own. Chen. It was there, just barely, a fragile thread. But the memories attached to it, the life it represented, were now a patchwork of holes and frayed edges. He had bought time. But at what cost? He was Chen, but a vast, vital part of Chen was now irrevocably gone. The entity was here, a suffocating presence, pressing down on him, trying to crush that single precious word. Forget it, Chen. Let it go. A resonant vibration that threatened to shatter his skull. Visions flickered at the periphery of his sight. Impossible landscapes, faces he almost recognized but couldn't place, all imbued with a sickly wrong quality. The entity wanted him to drown in the subjective, to surrender to the chaos it offered as reality. The metal was real. The rust flaking onto his palm was real. This was the anchor. He focused on the hum of an ancient, dust-laden radio receiver, its power light long dead, yet still vibrating with an unseen energy. It was a tangible object, a piece of objective truth. He could feel the entity's probing tendrils, searching for weakness, for a crack in his fragile resolve. It presented him with distorted memories. A child's laugh twisted into a sob, a sunny field transformed into a desolate wasteland. It wasn't creating new horrors. It was taking his half-formed memories and corrupting them, turning them against him. It feeds on what Chen give it. Chen realized with a jolt that sent a tremor through his exhausted frame. It doesn't create. It only warps. This was a weakness. Its power was parasitic, not generative. If he could deny it the fuel, if he could assert an objective reality, perhaps he could weaken its hold. He looked around the weather station, a place dedicated to the precise measurement of the world. Barometers, anemometers, thermometers. Instruments designed to quantify the indifferent forces of nature. The entity's attacks intensified, now a direct assault on his senses. The air grew impossibly heavy, tasting of ash and ozone. The radio receiver shrieked with a sound like tearing metal, then fell silent, its dead light flickering with an unnatural greenish glow. You are alone, Chen, always alone. There is no truth but what Chen show you. He closed his eyes, then forced them open. The illusion was potent, but he knew its source. This is a weather station. It measures the wind. It measures the pressure. It measures the temperature. He pointed a trembling finger at a large, brass-cased barometer on the wall, its needle frozen. It hadn't expected defiance, not this kind. It had expected fear, despair, surrender. Chen pressed his advantage. He moved towards an old, hand-cranked anemometer, its cup still and rusted. Its purpose was to measure wind speed, a simple, irrefutable fact of the physical world. As he touched it, a wave of revulsion emanated from the entity, a tangible push against his mind. It didn't want him to focus on objective truth. He began to turn the crank, slowly at first, then with more determination. The gears groaned, protesting years of disuse, but they turned. The cups began to spin, a grinding metallic rasp echoing in the station. "Stop!" the entity shrieked, its voice now a cacophony of distorted pleas and threats, trying to overwhelm him. The walls of the station seemed to ripple, the floor beneath his feet threatening to give way. But Chen kept turning. The resistance was immense, a direct mental and spiritual battle for control. Each turn was an assertion of reality, a defiance of the entity's lies. He understood now. The entity was connected to the house, to the isolation, to the forgotten corners of the world it had made its own. But the weather station was a place of connection, of reaching out, of recording universal truths. To sever its connection, he had to reclaim the conduit, assert the truth it was designed to record. He cranked harder, faster. The cup spun with a rising whine, a high-pitched protest against the entity's grip. The air in the station crackled, smelling of ozone and something burnt. The entity roared, a sound that tore at the fabric of his sanity. Chen felt his consciousness fraying at the edges, his vision blurring. But he clung to the name, to the object, to the simple, undeniable fact of the spinning cups. He was an observer, a recorder of truth, and this act was a declaration of war against the entity's dominion over falsehood. With a final, desperate surge of will, Chen forced one more rotation, then another. The anemometer's cup spun with a furious, defiant energy. It was not gone, not yet. But something had shifted. A fragile, invisible tether stretched taut between the entity and the world had been tested, and for the first time, it had begun to fray. The anemometer shrieked, a metallic banshee wail that tore through the air, drowning out the wind itself. Its cups, a blur of defiant motion, spun faster than Chen had ever thought possible, faster than the storm could ever demand. The entire weather station vibrated, a low, guttural hum that resonated in Chen's bones, vibrating up through the floorboards, into the very roots of their teeth. It was a sound that didn't just fill the room. It displaced the air, leaving behind a vacuum of pure, unadulterated force. And the entity, it recoiled. It had no physical form, yet Chen could feel its retreat, a sickening lurch in the air. It wasn't a roar of anger, but a lament, a protest against the forced unraveling. The swirling vortex of air, born of the anemometer's furious rotation, seemed to coalesce, becoming visible as a shimmering distortion. A spiraling column of pure, concentrated defiance. It wrapped around the shrinking core of the entity, tightening, compressing. Chen's eyes burned, watching the impossible. The shriek of the anemometer cut off abruptly. The vibrations died. Chen crumpled. The sudden release of tension was too much. Every muscle in their body screamed. Every nerve ending felt raw and exposed. The room, once a battleground of unseen forces, now stood eerily still. The anemometer, its cups motionless, seemed to mock Chen with its sudden stillness. It was just a machine again, a collection of metal and wires. But Chen knew better. It had been an instrument of their will, a conduit for a desperate, impossible defiance. Chen tried to push themselves up, but their limbs refused to obey. Their mind, too, felt like a shattered mirror. They tried to piece them together, to make sense of the victory, but the edges wouldn't align. There were gaps, vast chasms where coherent thought should have been. What had truly happened? Had it been real? Or had the isolation, the relentless pressure, finally broken something fundamental inside them? They looked at their hands, pale and trembling. They seemed alien, disconnected. The familiar lines of their palms, the faint scars, they were all there, yet they didn't feel like theirs. Their mind, once a fortress of logical thought, was now a ruin, its walls breached, its foundations cracked. Chen eventually managed to push themselves upright, leaning heavily against the rough-hewn wall. Their gaze drifted around the weather station, the silent sentinel that had witnessed their ordeal. The station stood, unburnt, unblemished, a monument to a battle fought in the unseen, a victory bought at an unbearable price. But the true desolation was within Chen. They were no longer who had arrived at this remote station, full of purpose and a quiet resilience. That person was gone, replaced by an echo, a haunted shell. Chen walked to the window, their reflections staring back at them. Eyes wide, pupils dilated, a gauntness etched into their features that hadn't been there before. They barely recognized the face. The house, the weather station, stood silent behind them. A watchful presence, forever bearing witness to the profound, enduring psychological cost of their victory.